Hello, and welcome back. We are now beginning the second half of the opioid monologues. In the first half, we focused extensively and exclusively on how the opioids impacted the individual. Now, in the second half of the opioid monologues, we are turning our attention to how the opioids impacted the nation. Okay? We're going to be emphasizing both how the opioid crisis got started and how anything that we perceive that resulted in a prolongation of the opioid crisis, anything that made the opioid crisis go on for longer than it should have. That's what we're going to focus on. Eventually, we will progress to our vision of how this opioid crisis will be resolved. It'll be a combination of telemedicine and subsidized buprenorphine for most people. Okay? We have divided the opioid crisis into 4 phases that we see here on our timeline that we built in the last video. Phase 1 runs from 1996, the year OxyContin launched, to 2013, the year the U.S. physicians finally began the needed decrease in opioid prescribing. Okay? Phase 1 is the period that we refer to as deceptive advertising. Our phase 2 runs from 2013 to 2016. This is the phase dominated by a massive explosion in opioid production driven by the DEA. Amazingly, U.S. physicians had finally recognized that they had been tricked and prescribed fewer opioid prescriptions beginning in 2013. In response, the DEA immediately increases production. Okay? Now, we got all this stopped, but look at this again. You get a decrease in prescribing and an increase in production. Okay, we got it all stopped. And we'll see all that in detail. Once we finally reverse this massive DEA increase in production, then the country is finally seeing a drop in diverted opioid to the streets. That's when China was ready with the influx of deadly fentanyl, along with heroin, into our country. We will discuss this in phase 3. Finally, phase 4 is our vision of how we conclude this opioid crisis, and with a combination of telemedicine and subsidized buprenorphine. But for now, let's focus in on this phase 1. And let's begin with how this opioid crisis got started. And let's be clear on 3 statements here. Okay, first, the opioid crisis was not started by physicians. The opioid crisis was not started by physicians. Physicians had a long history of a very conservative prescribing of opioids. Long-term opioids were restricted to end-of-life situations and to cancer. Long-term opioids were not used for orthopedic conditions or rheumatological conditions such as back pain and other medical conditions. It was a cancer drug. And we use quite a bit of a medication called MS-Contin and from a manufacturer called Purdue. So, first, the opioid crisis was not started by physicians. In actuality, we physicians were the target of a highly effective campaign of false and deceptive advertising. Secondly, the opioid crisis was not driven by science. No, the opioid crisis was not driven by science. In fact, and as we will be discussing, it wasn't science that drove the opioid crisis. It was lies and deception. The opioid crisis was launched and driven by lies. Lies predominantly by the folks over at Purdue Pharma and with OxyContin. Don't believe me? Don't trust my words? Take a look at this 2007 Department of Justice memo outlining how both the company and 3 top executives for OxyContin pled guilty. Specifically pled guilty to, and I quote, illegally misbranding OxyContin in an effort to mislead and defraud physicians and consumers. You can't get any clearer than that sentence. Mislead and defraud physicians and consumers. And this leads us to our third statement here, okay? The opioid crisis was driven at all times by greed, not medicine, not science. Greed. That's all this whole thing is all about. It's about greed and the overwhelming desire by a few to obtain money and fortune. The opioid crisis is not hard to understand. It's about money and greed. And with these 3 statements in mind, let's begin our review of the origins of the opioid crisis. We're going to start with this article by Caitlin Esch, okay, entitled How One Sentence Helped Set Off the Opioid Crisis. Read this article. Read it. I'm just going to be summarizing here, but read this article. Know this article is largely derived from documents that were sealed by a federal judge named Stevens and were sealed and kept away from us for years. Now, let's slow down here just a few seconds, okay? Let me say this. This sealing of court records by federal judges is a major contributor to the opioid crisis. The courts hid the truth from the public and from the physicians. The court, under Judge Booker T. Stevens, they had the evidence of the lies and fraud by OxyContin, and in 2004, Judge Stevens sealed the evidence. Reuters has done a fantastic piece on this. The LA Times has done a great piece on this. In fact, let me share this one quote from this LA Times article, and I quote, "His decision," meaning Judge Stevens, "his decision meant that for the first time, questions about OxyContin's duration would be aired at a trial. Sealed evidence would be laid out in public for class action attorneys, government investigators, doctors, and journalists to see. On the eve of that trial, Purdue agreed to settle the case. All the evidence under seal would remain confidential. The settlement did not require Purdue to admit any wrongdoing or change the way it told doctors to prescribe the drug OxyContin." What a tragedy. We as physicians and as the public could have known as early as 2004 the truth about the lies and the deception that were being spewed out by the criminally corrupt company that is Purdue Pharma. Oh yes, Purdue was finally forced to plead guilty to its actions, first in 2007 and again in 2020. But we could have known this information much earlier. We could have known this information as early as 2004. But federal judge Booker T. Stevens sealed the documents intentionally and by design so that the physicians and the public would not know. We will get into this in more detail later. And by the way, who did Purdue hire to argue its case in front of Judge Stevens? None other than Eric Holder, who went on to become one of our federal attorney generals. Thanks, Eric. And let's look at how this Reuters article describes it. And I quote, "Stevens rejected Purdue's motion that he dismiss the case and sided with the state's assertion that the material could convince a jury that Purdue's sales pitch was full of dangerous lies. But Stevens sealed the evidence on which he relied in that ruling. And when Purdue and the state reached a settlement that year before the case went to trial, the evidence remained hidden, out of sight to regulators, doctors, and patients." End of quote. Such a missed opportunity. I am certain we could have limited the scope and scale of this opioid crisis if we just could have gotten the truth out to the physicians. Instead, the physicians were subjected to years more of lies and deceptions coming out of the crew over at OxyContin. So let's go back to the article by Caitlin Esch, okay? How this one sentence helped set off the opioid crisis. I cannot stress this article enough. I encourage every one of you to read this article. Don't take my word for anything. Read this information yourself and come to your own conclusions, okay? One thing that I like about this Caitlin Esch article is that she gets right down to it and states the sentence right up front. And remember, this is the sentence that Caitlin Esch and others, including myself, are attributing with starting the opioid crisis. Think about that statement, starting the opioid crisis. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. And we are talking about the one sentence that started it all. Now think about that. Now, before we launch into the sentence, let's take a moment of preparation, okay? This sentence is from the FDA. This sentence is not from OxyContin. This sentence is not from Purdue Pharma. Now, did you hear what I just said? This sentence is from the FDA, not Purdue Pharma. This sentence, this one sentence, this sentence that so many, including myself, believe was solely responsible for the beginning of the opioid crisis, this one sentence came from the FDA, the very agency that we had trusted with our safety. Now, from that perspective, and before we share together the Caitlin Esch sentence, let's take a look at the mission statement from the FDA, and let's read this together. And I quote, "The Food and Drug Administration is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, and medical devices, and by ensuring the safety of our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation." End of quote. Protecting the public health. The FDA is responsible for protecting the public health. Now let's look a bit further into this FDA mission statement, and here we see one more way that the FDA is tasked to protect the public health is by, and I quote, "helping the public get the accurate science-based information." End of quote. Remember that term, science-based information. Science-based information. The FDA is responsible for protecting the public health and helping the public get the accurate science-based information that the public needs. Now please, keep these words in mind as we read together the one sentence and from the Caitlin Esch article. This one sentence that is from the FDA. And remember, the mission statement of the FDA is all about safety and science. Okay? So, here is the one sentence that according to Caitlin Esch and others, including myself, here is the one sentence that got this whole deadly snowball rolling, and I quote, "Delayed absorption as provided by OxyContin tablets is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug." End of quote. That's it. Sounds harmless enough. Delayed absorption as provided by OxyContin tablets is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug. How can that one sentence set off a chain of events that ultimately killed hundreds of thousands of people? Are these 18 or so words so powerful and so deadly that they can launch a process of death and destruction on par with the U.S. Civil War? They are just words, but they were issued by the FDA. And it's the first time that the FDA knowingly lied and tricked and betrayed the U.S. physicians. Let me tell you, in medical school, the FDA was revered as the premier institution, one of the premier institutions in the world. The FDA was above reproach. The FDA had a stellar record with physicians, at least coming through the 70s and 80s and into the 1990s. If it came from the FDA, it was as American and as reliable as mom and the apple pie. Okay, the FDA had done a fantastic job, and for decades. I started medical school in 1982. We were proud of our ethics and proud of the FDA. We felt we were an example of how to manage drug product and development and for the rest of the world, and we were. Bottom line, we trusted the FDA implicitly and without question. Now imagine you're in a stable relationship with someone for over 20 years. Imagine this person had never lied or misled you. If this person then set out to deceive you, well, there's a good chance you're going to get fooled. You're going to be deceived. And when the FDA lied to the physicians, and for the first time, after years of being able to be trusted, a whole bunch of physicians, myself included, we fell for it. We fell for it. We fell for it because we trusted the FDA. We had never had a reason to not trust the FDA, and ever before. So it's not just that Purdue Pharma and OxyContin lied. It's that they got the FDA to participate and go along with the lies. That's how this opioid crisis started. And that's why these 18 words are so deadly. We as physicians may and do hesitate to believe everything a pharmaceutical company and their many reps would tell us. We know that the pharmaceutical companies want to influence our thinking and behavior as physicians, and in an attempt to believe in and prescribe their product. That's what drug companies and drug reps do. but we physicians had never seen and were not prepared for the FDA to be part of the scam. Brilliant move by Purdue. Brilliant move by OxyContin. Sinister, deceptive, but brilliant and highly effective. Effective beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Now, where did Purdue and OxyContin come up with this plot, this ploy? Okay, let's go back to the Caitlin Esch article. And specifically, we're going to be looking at some of the documents that had been sealed away for years. Now, this is information that was kept away from physicians and for years. And certainly keeping this information away from those who so needed this knowledge, okay, meaning the prescribing physicians. Okay, that was not a good thing to keep that information away from the prescribing physicians. And let's note something here, okay? We keep going back to both this Caitlin Esch article and the LA Times article, okay? These two articles were the first to report on some of the documents that Judge Stevens had sealed, okay, back in West Virginia, back in the West Virginia court, way back in 2004. And I urge all of you to read both the Caitlin Esch article and the LA Times article. These are powerful, impactful, well-researched, well-written articles. But let's focus on something here for a moment. Let's look at the dates these articles finally came out. Okay? We see here on the LA Times a date in May of 2016. And we see here on the Caitlin Esch article a date in December of 2017. Now, many of these important sealed documents were from 1995 and 1996, some of them even older. This means that the effect of Judge Stevens to seal these Purdue OxyContin documents was to keep this information from physicians and the public for over 20 years. 20 years. And during that time, hundreds of thousands of people died. Think back to the first part of these opioid monologues. Remember, we were discussing at length the effect on the individual. And remember, we spoke at length about how having the wrong diagnosis and the wrong treatment had prolonged the opioid crisis for many, and many had died without the proper treatment, okay, and the proper treatment being with buprenorphine. Now we are turning our attention to the nation. And we're learning that one reason, and an important reason, that this opioid crisis went on for so long and in this nation and claimed so many lives is that the truth, the information that was so desperately needed, was sealed away, and by a court order of a federal judge named Judge Stevens in West Virginia. Now think about that. Think about those exact words the next time you want to blame the physicians for this opioid crisis. We physicians were lied to, and the truth was intentionally kept away from us. Okay? But now we're reviewing some of this information. The court seal has been lifted. And let's look at what we can learn about how this opioid crisis got started. More specifically, what were the actions and the motivations behind the early events. And on this, both the Caitlin Esch article and the LA Times article are in agreement. Money was the motivation. Money, or perhaps I should say, fear of losing money. Okay? Let's start with the LA Times article. Okay? We see here this quote, and I quote, "The company owners were the Sacklers, a New York family of physicians and philanthropists who bought Purdue in 1952. By the late 1980s, the patent on its main source of revenue, a morphine pill for cancer patients could use called MS-Contin, the patent was running out." And here's the quote, "Executives anticipated a massive loss of revenue," end of quote. So we see the three Sackler brothers. Okay, where are my Sackler brothers? Okay, there they are. And we know they had made millions off of a drug called MS-Contin and used primarily for cancer pain. And that was the norm at the time and a long-held medical tradition. Long-term opioids were for cancer treatment. But look again at this quote. Executives anticipated a massive loss of revenue. By now, the Sacklers had made a name for themselves, particularly in the upper crust of New York society. Their names were prominent, and due to the lavish donations that they made, fancy homes, fancy clothes, fancy friends. But all that was now threatened. The old drug, MS-Contin, was going off patent, and they had to find a new drug to take its place. Otherwise, they're going to lose revenue. And they did find a new drug with OxyContin. See the names? MS-Contin, OxyContin. MS stands for morphine sulfate. So all they did was just swap out the morphine and with oxycodone. No big mystery here. And frankly, I don't have a problem with a company doing normal business stuff like this. There is nothing sinister about swapping out morphine with oxycodone, okay, and getting a new patent. That's normal business, okay? But here's where it gets sinister. The Sacklers, evidently, were not happy with their millions with an M. No, they wanted billions with a B. And in order to get into the billions, the new drug, OxyContin, would need to break out of the diagnosis of cancer pain and break into being used for all types of moderate to severe pain. Back pain, arthritis pain, orthopedic injuries, surgeries, migraine headaches. That's the bigger market, okay? That's where the billions could be found, okay? To quote the Caitlin Esch article, okay? And I quote, "They didn't want to be put into the cancer bucket," said Dr. Caleb Alexander of Johns Hopkins, end of quote. But there was a problem, and the problem was us physicians, or more specifically, the problem was how us physicians would only use long-term opioids for cancer pain. We physicians were in the way. We were the problem as far as they were concerned. Our long-held tradition of a very conservative use of opioids was standing between the Sacklers and their billions of dollars, between the dog and the fire hydrant. And greed is a powerful force in some people. So they needed a plan, a plot, a scheme. They needed some way to get the doctors to change the long-held and conservative tradition of reserving large doses of opioids only for cancer. And they needed the doctors to start writing large and long-term prescriptions for medical conditions other than cancer. That's it. It's that simple. Convince the doctors to change their ways, and billions would flow to the Sackler family. So, and according to the documents uncovered by both the LA Times and Marketplace with Caitlin Esch, okay, according to these documents, a focus group of physicians was convened, 40 physicians. The question was, what will it take for you physicians to stop writing big prescriptions of opioids only for cancer and to start writing big prescriptions of opioids for anything and everything that was painful? What will it take for you physicians to change your behavior? Tell us. We want our billions of dollars, so tell us. And, by the way, we're willing to do about anything to get our money, our billions of dollars. So, long story short, Purdue convened a focus group of about 40 physicians in 1995. And the result was a report entitled, quote, Purdue Frederick Company Focus Group Research and Findings, OxyContin for Non-Cancer Pain Management. And let's review together the most important recommendation from this group of 40 physicians, okay? And let's look at the advice these 40 doctors shared with Purdue OxyContin, okay? And we see it right here in the Caitlin Esch article, and I quote, Purdue should conduct clinical studies on non-cancer patients. If Purdue could show its new drug was less likely to be abused, it could convince more doctors to prescribe it for non-cancer pain and dramatically impact the long-term sales of OxyContin for treatment of non-cancer pain. Now, slow down here a moment. This is important. I know we are long in this video. It doesn't matter. Okay, this is important. Every word in that quote matters. If you want to understand the origins of the opioid crisis, you are looking at it. Okay, Marketplace and Caitlin Esch and this article and this LA Times article, okay, you're digging into finally these documents that were sealed back in 2004. And we're beginning to see some answers to the question, what happened? Okay, look here again at this quote from the focus group. And let's take the time to go through this word for word. And I quote again, Purdue should conduct clinical studies on non-cancer patients. If Purdue could show its new drug was less likely to be abused, it could convince more doctors to prescribe it for non-cancer pain. Now that's easy enough. Do some studies on people who do not have cancer and show that your drug is less likely to be abused and that your drug works, and convince the FDA of this. And we physicians will loosen up our opioid prescribing habits if it's the right thing to do for our patients. That's what that quote is saying. Do some studies. Convince the FDA. We trust the FDA. And if you can convince the FDA of your effectiveness and safety, we as physicians, we're all in for anything that helps our patients and doesn't hurt them. And well, frankly, that's all reasonable. But there is a nuance here. Purdue OxyContin never did the studies. There was no research done. There was no science that was involved. But somehow, and this is the heart of the matter, okay, this is the moment of truth and the origins of the opioid crisis. But somehow, Purdue found an FDA regulator that was willing to adjust the language so that it looked like Purdue OxyContin had done the studies and had science behind their product, and had science that their product was safer and less likely to be abused. Okay, they skipped the whole part about doing the clinical studies. Okay, now this is really important. This is the origin of the opioid crisis. Let's take a couple of minutes and add as much clarity as possible. The Sacklers had made millions, but that wasn't enough. They wanted to make billions. The plan was to break out of the cancer bucket and become indicated by the FDA for everything painful. They asked a group of doctors how to do this. What do we need to do to get you doctors to write OxyContin for non-cancer pain? And the doctor said, do some studies that shows your medication works and that it's not abused and that it's safe. If your medication works for non-cancer pain and it's safe for non-cancer pain and for these patients, okay, and if it's the right thing to do for the patients, we physicians will use it. But here's the catch. Purdue OxyContin never did a single study. They never did any safety studies or level of abuse studies. They never did any science at all. Instead, they took a dishonest shortcut and found an FDA regulator who would write it up as if all the work had been done and everything looked good. That's what happened here. That's how the opioid crisis got started. Purdue OxyContin skipped the science and did what looks like a sweetheart deal, and with the regulator at the FDA named Dr. Curtis Wright. Without the science to support anything, Dr. Wright authorized the 18 words in the OxyContin product insert that read, and we all know them, delayed absorption as provided by OxyContin tablets is believed to reduce the abuse liability of a drug. Is believed? Is believed? Is believed by whom? Santa Claus? The Easter Bunny? There's no place in an FDA product insert for the words is believed. And 2 years later, Dr. Curtis Wright takes a full-time job with guess who? Right, Purdue. That's not allowed. You're not supposed to be able to do that. Okay, that's against the rules, but nothing happened. Now, before we close this video, let's take one more look at this. This is very important. And this time, let's lay out a visual aid to assist in our understanding. We begin here with the desire, the motivation. And we begin with the three Sackler brothers. We know that the money from the old product, MS Contin, is running out. And we know they're scared of the drop in revenue that's coming. We know they want the next product, OxyContin, to make even more money. They're not satisfied with the billions being prescribed exclusively for cancer. Now they want to break into the billions by being prescribed for pain from other non-cancer ailments. But there's a problem. Okay, there is a roadblock. Okay, there is this pesky problem known as standard of care. And it included using long-term opioids only for cancer and end-of-life situations. Now, it's hard to consistently make billions when you're just an end-of-life medication. Okay, so the powers that be at Purdue OxyContin convened a panel of 40 physicians and simply asked, what is it going to take for you physicians to start prescribing OxyContin for ailments other than cancer? And the answer was simple. Just do the clinical trials that demonstrate and prove both the effectiveness and safety of OxyContin. No big deal here. Fairly normal stuff. Nothing earth-shattering so far. Okay? But now we get to where this begins to turn criminal. What was supposed to happen next is that Purdue OxyContin would do a series of clinical trials. And if the clinical trials, the science, showed safety and effectiveness, well, the FDA would reflect this in the all-important product insert, and Purdue OxyContin reps could then begin detailing the physicians. But that didn't happen. Purdue OxyContin did no studies, no clinical trials, no science at all. There were no safety studies. There were no effectiveness studies. Okay? There were no studies on abuse liability or abuse potential. There were no studies done at all. Instead, OxyContin found an ally within the FDA that would go ahead and put deceptive wording into the package insert, okay? And that would lead the reader to believe that the studies had been done. This FDA ally was Dr. Curtis Wright. And 2 years later, Dr. Wright left the FDA and began to work for Purdue. To me, that sounds like a sweetheart deal. And that's where the 18-word sentence we've already reviewed together comes from. Remember the sentence? Delayed absorption as provided by OxyContin tablets is believed, not proven, not studied, is believed to reduce the abuse liability of the drug, and we physicians missed it. It was quiet, it was sinister, it was a well-conceived crime. A ridiculously successful crime. 600 OxyContin reps, now armed with a lie, and from the FDA that we had trusted, were let loose upon the physicians of this country. Bottom line, it moved the long-held and established conservative prescribing of opioids. The tradition crumbled under the assault by the 600 drug reps. We physicians fell for it, myself included. It's painful to say and admit, okay, but I had never expected any such criminal activity from the FDA. None of us did. We were not prepared to confront something like this, and from a group we had so revered and trusted, the FDA. They tricked us and we fell for it. The FDA worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Now the Sacklers and Purdue OxyContin are finally making and enjoying their precious billions of dollars. The plot worked. The scheme worked. And we physicians were writing prescriptions for opioids for things we never had done so far in the past. The old conservative norms fell. New, much more liberal prescribing norms had taken root. But we physicians had been lied to and deceived, and our patients suffered. One of the casualties of this whole criminal and sordid mess was that for the first time, many physicians, myself included, we violated our Hippocratic oath. We didn't do it intentionally, but still it happened. We wrote prescriptions that harmed people. Now remember, the Hippocratic oath, it says, first, do no harm. It's that simple. First, do no harm. We never, ever would have trusted a pharmaceutical company and moved long-held conservative norms of prescribing opioids. No, not based on a pharmaceutical company. But we trusted the FDA, and the long-held conservative norms were moved. This opioid crisis could never have been started by a pharmaceutical company. This opioid crisis was started by a dishonest regulator named Dr. Curtis Wright and at the FDA. My name is Dr. Doug Smith, and these are the Opioid Monologues.